Good morning, sleepyheads. How's everybody doing? So people will be trickling in. I talked to a couple people, they're working their way down. So I'm sure they stayed up to watch the Colorado game last night. I don't know if you did that, but Colorado came back and won that game. They did a 98-yard drive with 2 minutes to go in the game and a 2-point conversion to get into overtime, and ended up scoring a touchdown to win the game. So it was, you know, Coach Prime doing a good job, 3-0. It's pretty amazing. I don't know about you, but I thought the dinner last night was really great. You've all been to a lot of these, and the food there was dang near the best I've had at a conference dinner. It was great. So we're thanking the hotel staff as we see them daily.
Were we supposed to eat the flour? I didn't figure that out.
You could eat the flour if you wanted to. That was a bold move, though, Daryl. If you would have eaten the flour.
Fortune favors the bold, right?
That's right. So that was great. We have a really great day of topics today. It's going to be hard to make choices throughout the day. So please enjoy that, and we're not really ultra concerned about the scheduling today. We'd like to stay as close to on time as we can, but you know, sometimes it just doesn't happen. So we'll be as flexible as we can be. I think it worked out okay yesterday. We're very happy to have all three of our award winners here in town for the event tomorrow, and Ted and Dan have agreed to talk about their work on their projects, which is fascinating. I mean, the foreign language part of it for me has always been a hurdle. Even going to England has been a challenge for me. But what Dan has gone through, well, and Ted too, in their research has just been phenomenal. And the results are really quite excellent. Ted received his BA in political science from Harvard and his MA from the University of Washington. He served a couple of years in the Peace Corps in Thailand, and spent 8 years in commercial banking before he went to Moody's Investment Service. So if you got any questions on that, I mean, we got an interesting economic picture. Maybe it'll help you. He worked at Moody's for 20 years with assignments in New York, London, Tokyo, and Hong Kong. In 2015, he completed his MA in the history of warfare at King's College. What a great place to go back to school. That's all I can say. And also returned to get his PhD, completing that in 2020. A remarkable life career, and we had a great discussion last night about the nature of awards as a historian. So there's people who go through their entire history life and never see an award stage at all, and we were talking about that, and Ted said this is the first one after doing this for so long. And I just told him sometimes you just have to be patient. Because what he created was very, very good. He's written 20 books, monographs, and aviation military history, including Aerial Nationalism, which is the newest one. Tremendous stuff. And that was, let's see, History of Aviation in Thailand. The Smithsonian published that. 10th Air Force in World War II, published by Schiffer, and 14 other Osprey titles. So he's been doing this a little while. His study of the air-cooled radial aircraft engine production in Britain and America in World War II is going to be published by the Society of Automotive Engineers, and to me that sounds exactly like something that I.B. Holly would have written in his earlier days. It's really kind of neat, but tying those titles together. And he lives with his wife in Seattle. And we'll introduce him to speak in just a second. Daniel Jackson, this is really funny because he and I have a lot in common. He didn't really know this probably until yesterday, but He's an '09 grad from the Academy, and he's authored a couple books: The Forgotten Squadron, 449th Fighter Squadron, World War II, Famine, Sword and Fire, Liberation of Southwest China in World War II. Obviously, he's a China expert. Combat veteran, Special Forces, was at Hurlburt and Duke for 8+4. He's been in the business a while. He's now working on his PhD at the University of Wisconsin. Fluent in Chinese, and he had a lengthy assignment over there to work on that in the archives. As much as a Westerner can do, as we've heard the different ways to do that yesterday. His comprehensive research shows that helping downed airmen transcends deep political divisions of wartime China, with nationalists, communists, and even alleged collaborators realizing the commonality of their struggle against the Japanese. Drawing extensively on sources and interviews in the United States and China, Jackson sketches an epic historical drama documenting the astonishing extent of Sino-American cooperation. This is not just another flying tiger book, as Dick Hallion pointed out after he reviewed it. It's a detailed history of the 14th Air Force and their lost airmen and others in the CBI. Notably, Dan also received the Air Force Historical Foundation Cadet Award in 2009, and I think he's the first award winner to do both. So he's setting a standard. He'll be back in the department teaching history in 2025. So it's great, great stuff. Ted Young.
Thank you, Dick, for your introduction. Ladies and gentlemen, can you all hear me? Can you hear me in the back? Okay. I have some very good news for you. Dick has asked me to cut my presentation back to 3 hours, so I'll get started. What I'd like to do this morning, this is the title of the article that I wrote for the Met Journal. It's an abridged version of my master's thesis. I'd like to give you a brief introduction to the Air Commandos, talk about how this debate came about, talk about my research, what I found, what I didn't find, and some conclusions that I drew. And then I'll turn it over to Dan, and hopefully I can work this machine correctly.
Just hit the up and down button.
Here we go. So, the Air Commandos were a unique air unit created during World War II. They encapsulated a variety of aspects of air power. This photograph shows 4 P-51As of the 1st Air Commandos flying over a field in India with a B-25 below. They had a fighter section and a bomber section to provide close air support. They had a transport section with C-47s. They had a light aircraft section to evacuate wounded and carry in supplies. And they had 150 gliders to take troops into Burma. Let's see. Yeah, there we go. Okay. The Air Commandos came about through a commitment that General Hap Arnold made to this man, Major General Ord Wingate, who wanted to have a long-range penetration mission into Burma. And Arnold committed to provide aircraft to him to complete this mission, assigning Phil Cochran and another man, Colonel John Allison, as the commanders of the unit. Whoopsie-doo, sorry. There we go. This was called Operation Thursday, and it took place on March 5th to 11th, 1944. It was a fly-in. They flew in a group of troops by gliders. They landed in an open field. They brought in with them these tiny little bulldozers, specially designed for this, and carved out an airfield. And over the next 4 or 5 days, landed 9,000 men, 1,100 mules, 500,000 tons of supplies, both with the Air Commandos and with regular Army Air Force transport squadrons and RAF squadrons. The success of this led Arnold to commit to offer to Mountbatten, Lord Louis Mountbatten, who was commander of Southeast Asia Command, 4 combat cargo groups, each with 100 transports, to fly troops in once the field had been captured, 4 air commando groups, and basically more than 400 transport aircraft. And this is in April 1944, when Mountbatten was absolutely desperate for transport aircraft, because the 14th Army in Burma was increasingly relying on air transport because there were no roads through the jungle. But Arnold had some concerns. He believed the air commando concept, airlifting troops behind enemy lines, was a new technique in air-ground warfare, possibly revolutionary, he said in one letter. He wanted these resources to be used with vigor and imagination, that's his quote, because he mistrusted the RAF command and leadership in India, and in fact the entire British High Command. And he said in another letter, he had no desire for the dead hand of higher command to interfere with the employment of the air commandos. Effectively, what he wanted was that these air commando groups and the air combat cargo groups would only be used for special long-range penetration missions. He wanted them restricted to that. And he put some conditions in his letters to Mountbatten. First of all, he wanted the operations to be directed by a senior USAF commander. He wanted a US Air Force, Army Air Force chain of command. However, he wanted the theater to support these groups, which I thought was sort of cheesy, but never mind. And he did not want these groups to be integrated with Air Command Southeast Asia, which was the integrated RAF, Army Air Force unit, command that had been set up in the fall of 1943. Whoopsie-doo, sorry. There we go. Mountbatten had two principal air commanders in this integrated command. On the left, we have Major General George Stratemeyer, who was commander of Army Air Force India-Burma Theater. He was deputy commander of Air Command Southeast Asia, which was the integrated air force, and he was commander of something called Eastern Air Command, which was the operational units of Air Command Southeast Asia. To his right is Howard Davidson, who was commander of 10th Air Force, and then Lord Louis Mountbatten. On the right picture in the middle is Air Marshal Sir Richard Pearce, who commanded all RAF units in India, Burma, and also who was commander of Air Command Southeast Asia. These two men were reluctant to accept the conditions that Arnold was trying to impose. And their reluctance has been criticized in some of the histories. I've had a long-standing interest in the air commandos going back many, many years. And in some of these histories, they were criticized. Lack of imagination and drive, inability to accept new revolutionary ideas. One historian criticized them for their focus on integrating the air commandos, which is what they wanted to do, into the usual chain of command structure. When I was reading this, I thought, ouch, this is sort of harsh. Could there be another reason? And I was really struck last night when Colonel Mellinger said to us, as historians, we should challenge assertions. So this has been in the back of my mind. And as Dick kindly said in his very kind introduction, 2014 I went to King's College London to study for an MA in the history of warfare. I was the oldest kid in my class, which was fun. And one of the first things they had us do was read Clausewitz on war. And there were a couple of principles that jumped out at me. First of all, concentration of force. The commander should be able to concentrate all the forces he has available in the right place at the right time. Absolutely critical principle. The second was economy of force. That you use, the commander is able to use everything he possibly can, all the different forces. And Clausewitz says it's absolutely critical that no forces remain idle. If they remain idle, they're useless. You achieve unity of effort, combining concentration and economy of force, through unity of command. And these principles stuck with me. The second thing we did, or I did during the course, is I was introduced to the concept of coalition warfare, which I'd never really studied before. And I did a paper on Marshal Ferdinand Foch, who was appointed Supreme Allied Commander in World War I in March 1918, when the Germans had this massive attack, breaking through British and French lines. He commanded British forces, French forces, and American forces. And it was not an easy thing to do, as you can imagine. This introduced me to the concept of national caveats. When a country sends a force to a coalition, as we've done in various wars, World War II, Korea, Vietnam, Gulf War, Afghanistan, sometimes countries will say, well, yes, our forces are going to be there, but you can only use them in this way. The most critical aspect of this is command and control. Who gets to command the nation's forces, and what do they get to order them to do? when it came time to do my master's thesis, I decided to look at this debate between Arnold and the commanders in the field about deploying the air commandos. How were they going to do it? Who was going to make the decisions? And I was very fortunate to be in London to be able to do this because I had some phenomenal resources. First of all, I had the Air Ministry records and Air Command Southeast Asia records in the National Archives at Kew. And I looked at my files last night. I went through 53 different file categories about Air Command Southeast Asia and the Air Ministry records. I had the papers of Lord Louis Mountbatten in the University of Southampton, south of London. I got permission to look at those papers. And one of the things I wanted to tell you, that was such an amazing thrill. I mean, to hold this letter in my hand, and it says, "Dear Dickie," and there's the text, and the bottom is "Yours truly, Hap." I'm thinking, oh my God, you know, Hap Arnold touched this letter, and so did Lord Louis Mountbatten. Unbelievable thrill. I got permission to look at the papers of the Marshal of the RAF, Lord Charles Portal, which was at Christchurch, Oxford, and the Air Force Historical Research Agency were saints, absolute saints. I bombarded them with requests for American records for the Assistant Chief of Staff Plans Division, for 10th Air Force, Eastern Air Command, and they sent me all this stuff on DVD. They were just fantastic. And I also had about, I don't know, 40, 50 different records. The other point I wanted to make, it was not just the men in Southeast Asia who were opposing Arnold's conditions, but also Charles Portal, as commander of the RAF. And the essence of the debate was this. What I found in going through all this correspondence, all these in between Pierce and Portal, Portal and Arnold, Portal and his representative in Washington, D.C., Air Marshal William Walsh, excuse me, it focused on these issues that Clausewitz had noted: concentration of force, economy of a force, and unity of command. And this is what Portal wrote in one of his letters, which really summarized the argument. Essential that an air commander-in-chief have latitude to use all the resources in his theater in the most economic way possible. And what the guys in Southeast Asia wanted to do, their principal arguments were twofold. And unfortunately, Stratemeyer had to back out. Because Stratemeyer at one point said to Pierce and Portal, "Look, Arnold's my boss. I can't go against him. I agree with you philosophically, but he's my boss." There were two things. First of all, they didn't want any force in Southeast Asia to be idle. Southeast Asia Command was one of the lowest priorities in the war. Europe got everything first. Anything left over went to the Pacific. What the Pacific couldn't use or didn't want went to the China-Burma India theater. So they're always shorthanded. And the idea of 400 transport aircraft sitting there on airfields in India not doing anything, waiting for the next long-range penetration mission, to them made absolutely no sense whatsoever. The second thing they said, look, we can train regular squadrons to do these type of operations. We have these special units, the combat cargo groups, the air commando groups. If we need to have a special mission, it's going to be fairly straightforward to get these groups all together, coordinate an operation, and execute it. And that was their principal arguments. And this goes back and forth, all during May. Lots of not emails, but telegrams and letters and stuff. Particularly, there's an Air Marshal Walsh in Washington is talking directly with Arnold about this and is having a really tough time. And it's not Walsh, excuse me, it's William Welsh. He writes to Portal May 31st about his conversations with Arnold. And he says Arnold is being dogmatic and inflexible. And Portal writes back, "Let it rest. I'll talk to Arnold when I see him," right? This is June 3rd. A week later, Arnold goes to England for a meeting with the combined chiefs of staff, and he goes to tour the invasion beaches. And he has lunch with Portal. This is the critical period. This is a critical moment in this debate. And what happens? He has lunch. What does Arnold say about the lunch in his diary? Discuss this and that. The great frustration of my research is I have no idea what they talked about. I can't find anything. And to my great regret, when I was in London, I couldn't go back to Washington to look at Arnold's papers. There may be something in there, I don't know. But I went through Portal's papers, found nothing. Went through Patton's papers, found nothing. Went through the papers of the Air Command Southeast Asia, went through the 10th Air Force, everything. No one says what happened. So that really got me, so what do I do? So then I thought, well, all right, you don't know what Arnold said. You don't know whether he changed his mind. You don't know how Portal convinced him, if he did. But let's look at what actually happened after this lunch. So what happens after June 1944? A couple of things. 3 combat cargo groups get assigned to India. The third combat group is the first. It's organized in the theater, is assigned to the Northern Area Combat Command, Stilwell's Chinese forces, and begins flying regular operations immediately. The first combat cargo group arrives in August 1944 and starts flying regular cargo missions immediately. The fourth combat cargo group arrives in November 44 and begins flying regular combat missions immediately. So none of these groups are restricted to the kinds of operations that Arnold wanted. I thought, okay, well, that's interesting. The second thing was the first Air Commander Group and the second Air Commander Group are reformed. First Air Commander Group is reformed, 2 fighter squadrons, still has a bomber section, transport squadron, and 3 squadrons of light aircraft. And they start flying regular combat missions as soon as they go back into action, I think in September. Second Air Commando Group arrives in December. And if I can have just a little personal aside, the Mustang you see here, it's actually an F6 photographic Mustang. What got me interested in the Air Commandos was 40 years ago, when I was researching my book on the history of the Thai Air Force, meeting 2 Royal Thai Air Force officers who'd been on the receiving end of a strafing attack by these guys and their Mustangs, which is a whole other story. Anyway, all these units that were supposed to be segregated, utilized only for these long-range penetration missions, are now operating just as regular units. The other thing that happens is Arnold gets his American chain of command. In September, they set up, the Air Command Southeast Asia sets up something called the Combat Cargo Task Force. This gathered all the transport units in the theater, American and British, there are actually some Canadian squadrons there, into one unit. It has the Air Commando groups assigned, and it has an American commander, Brigadier General Frederick Evans. He reports directly to Stratemeyer. That's an American chain of command. But Stratemeyer is as commander of Eastern Air Command, which is part of the Integrated Air Force. So it is a American chain of command sort of in name only. And I wondered, could this have been sort of the face-saving thing, where Portal says to Arnold, look, let us use these squadrons. We'll give you the command structure you want. I don't know, again, I can't find the letter. What then happens is the second part of the argument that these the air commanders had in Air Command Southeast Asia. In the fall of '44, General William Slim, who's the best British general of World War II, is marching his 14th Army down into Burma, pursuing the Japanese. He's completely supplied by air support. 90% of the supplies for 14th Army come by air. He has an absolutely brilliant campaign, the Battle of Mektila, which took place in February, March 1945. He sends a division, 17th Division, and a tank regiment, 2 tank regiments. They break through Japanese lines, they cross the Irrawaddy River, and they have this lightning drive to seize the town of Mektila, which was the Japanese administrative and logistical capital in central Burma. And the Japanese have to get rid of him. They're completely surrounded by the Japanese, and they use the Combat Cargo Task Force to fly in supplies under fire, ammunition, take out wounded, everything. They use the Air Commandos for close air support. It is a phenomenally successful operation. And to my mind, it shows that the guys in Southeast Asia were correct, that when they had to, they could bring all these units together, plan an operation, and execute it. And that was the conclusion I came to in my article. And now I'll turn it over to Dan. And we'll have questions after Dan's presentation. So thank you. Yeah.
Okay, well, thank you, Ted. And thank you all for showing up early on a Sunday morning to, I guess, the Church of Airpower here in Denver, Colorado. And I appreciate that kind introduction, Dick. I'm always appreciative, Ted, to anybody that's doing work on the Air Commandos, because that's my professional lineage. I did, my first ops squadron was the 319th, which was the C-47 squadron in Operation Thursday, which started on a Sunday, but whatever. And then my last squadron was the 6SOS, so a lot of great heritage there. One of our alums in the 319th was Dick Cole, who was Jimmy DeLille's co-pilot during the Doolittle raid. He was the engineering officer for the C-47 squadron during Operation Thursday, so just a lot of cool connections. And then I'm also indebted to Ted's research, especially in his first book, like the fact that there's an English language book about the history of the Thai Air Force. I'm sure we all have experienced that air power history tends to focus on technology, and therefore the most technologically advanced players out there, whether it's the United States, Russia, the British, the French throughout the history. And so finding things on our allied air forces, especially in Southeast Asia or other kind of tertiary theaters, is very valuable. So I appreciate that. Thank you. Thank you. So I'm not going to spoil the ending of my book because I want you to buy it, and I have some copies here if anybody wants to. But I'm going to talk about how I came to this idea and went about the research and kind of how that research has been employed since then. So we'll go through this stuff. So first of all, just to let you all know who I am. Yep, my beautiful wife here, who so patiently listens to way too much about airplanes. So I grew up in Colorado Springs, and then went to the Air Force Academy. I don't think I would have even known about the Air Force Academy if I didn't grow up there. I wasn't from a military family at all. Went to pilot training at NJEP in Shepherd, and then got my MA while I was on active duty. I did 7 deployments as a U-28 pilot from the 319th, and then transitioned over to be a combat aviation advisor in the 6SOS. Specialized in Southeast Asia, learned Tagalog, flew with the Philippine Air Force, which was a lot of fun. I've done, I would not claim to fluency in Chinese. We were just in Taiwan doing research for my dissertation this summer, and my brain was like overheating most of the time during those interviews, but I try really hard. I've done 3 books about World War II in China, and then right now I'm working on Southeast Asia during the Cold War for my dissertation. So just to talk about where this idea came from for Fallen Tigers specifically, anybody that's worked on the CBI theater during World War II knows that most of the stuff, most of the literature about this theater is very polemical, very partisan. You know, it's a Stilwell person, or it's a Chennault person, or it's somebody that loves Chiang Kai-shek or hates Chiang Kai-shek, or somebody that's trying to like reformulate our views of Mao Zedong and make him into like a military genius or something. There's very little like folks trying to integrate these things or get to the ground truth of these clashes of personalities. And it's this very personality dependent theater like we just heard about. There's so many like mistrust, hurt feelings. It's really interesting. It's a really interesting case in the difficulties of doing anything in a coalition. So this is something that I noticed in my previous work, and I was really interested in kind of like digging down, like what actually happened. What is the ground truth? You know, you get all these criticisms about Chiang Kai-shek and how he's mishandling the war from Stilwell and his acolytes, and how he's corrupt, how he's saving stuff to battle the communists. You get a lot of claims from the communists, especially nowadays, that we were the ones that actually fought the Japanese during World War II. The nationalists didn't do anything. And so it's really interesting trying to like kind of sort through those things. The other thing that I noticed about histories of this theater is that they're largely, if they're not polemical, they're largely anecdotal. So you have a lot of memoirs, and if you were to think that those memoirs were a representative sample, you would think that like damn near everybody that flew in that theater was an ace. you know. But there were, I think, maybe like 70 to 80 aces out of tens of thousands of airmen that flew in that theater. And so it's not a representative view of what it was like for somebody there. And so it was interesting. Glenn Bonita is one of the guys that I interviewed for my first book, and he talked a little bit about his evasion experience. He was shot down in May of 1944 on what, to that time, was the largest mission in China, which was 40-something airplanes. So that tells you the difference in scale between the combat that's going on in Europe at the time, where they're putting up 1,000-plane raids, and the 40-some-odd planes that they put up in China. That was the biggest raid of the time at that point in the war. But he gets shot down. He's flying a P-51 Mustang with the 76th Fighter Squadron, and ends up rescued by Chinese guerrillas and civilians, and said this, I owe a debt to the Chinese people. There's no way I can pay it back. They saved my life. And it was deeply meaningful to him, to the point where when he died in 2010, he actually had his ashes interred in a museum dedicated to the army that rescued him in China. So that his ashes are in China with the folks that rescued him. So it was a deeply meaningful experience to him. And so you hear some of these anecdotes about the willingness of the Chinese people to rescue Americans. The Doolittle raid is another good example where we hear some of these anecdotes about the Chinese people rescuing the Doolittle raiders. And I wanted to see, like, what is the truth of this? Was this like a widespread phenomenon, or are these just little anecdotes that are coming up? And so what I started to do is collect all of the missing aircrew reports that were filed for combat missions originating in China during World War II, originating or supposed to terminate in China during World War II, which turned out to be a lot. 680 some odd airplanes, 698 airplanes, 1,907 airmen reported missing. And here's where you run into one of the legitimate criticisms of Chenault. This guy was not good at administration. Holy cow. So, like, some of these were never closed out, even though the guy was found. Some of them were never filed in the first place. So I had to go beyond the missing aircrew reports. I was going through unit historical records, figuring out when they lost folks, trying to correlate that to the missing in action list that the DPAA still maintains, trying to look at, like, funerary records in the United States. Is like, oh, this guy was obviously, his body was found because he's now buried here in Omaha or whatever. And just trying to catalog all of that, create a database so that I can then look at what is the aggregate truth of this phenomenon. And I actually added this in yesterday, Robert, after you talked about having stuff available online. So this is available online. If you go to forgottensquadron.com, you can hit the menu over on the right and go to the missing aircrew database. And it's searchable, or you can browse it if you want to browse through 1,900 names randomly. You can search by all of these different functions. It'll come up with a record like that you can then click on the right with view, and you'll get this great little snippet, what the missing aircrew report number is, what unit the guy was from, the information on the airplane, why the airplane was lost, when the airplane was lost, where the airplane was lost, who was lost on the airplane, and what their fate ended up being. So that was the first part of the research effort, which was a lot of archival work, it was a lot of database work, and the next part was kind of carrying that forward into the field and doing research in China. And it was really cool because immediately we were able to see the utility of this database. So this guy is Pei Hai-ching, who lives in Yunnan province in southwest China. And listening to his story, I had my database available on my iPad there. And as he's giving the details of his rescue of this airman who was shot down right near his home, I was able to actually find out who that airman was. He never knew. His interaction with this guy lasted all of like 5 minutes. He actually pulled him out of the river, which is amazing because I'm a pretty average height American, and that's him standing at his full height. But what else was amazing to me was that this guy was actually a deserter from the Nationalist Army. This is like the poster child for no longer believes in the cause, like has become hopeless, like left his post during a battle because he was so hopeless about the battle against the Japanese. But still, when he sees an American there that needs help, he wades into a really rough river. This is the Salween River that he's wading into to like pull this guy to shore and save his life. And so actually what was really cool was we were able to connect him. Francis Forbes is the guy that he saved. Francis Forbes is no longer alive, but he has family that's still around. And we were actually able to connect Forbes' nephew with Pei and give him this plaque showing him who he saved. This is really cool. And it showed the power of kind of fusing the local information with the archival American information, what's possible when you do these things, and we'll come back to that. So what did we find out? This is kind of the aggregate data. You know, you got a map over there that's got a dot for killed, captured, missing, or rescued for all of these 1,900 airmen, and then the overall graph. So killed is self-explanatory. Missing are folks that are still missing in action. So obviously they died, but we don't have accounting for where their body is. Prisoner of the Japanese, and then eventually rescued. So what's really interesting when you look at this graph is, and you compare it to other theaters of World War II, is that this side is roughly the same as Western Europe. The guys in the 8th and 9th Air Forces. If they went down in enemy-occupied Western Europe, they had about a 50% chance of surviving the crash or bailout, which makes sense. You're going down usually because of enemy action. That means somebody's trying to kill you, and about 50% of the time they're successful. What's really interesting though is this little wedge here. If you survive the crash or bailout in Europe, you had about a 20% chance of an underground organization getting you back to friendly lines. And so what was interesting to me is we have all of this like legends, this cultural feeling about like the French underground, the Belgian underground, and their bravery in rescuing American airmen. There's a lot of novels and stuff to that effect, but it was only successful about 1 out of 5. In China, you practically had to land on top of a Japanese soldier to get taken captive. If you survived the crash or bailout, you had a 90% chance of making it back to a friendly airbase. And what's amazing is that when you look at these maps over here, this is not restricted to the parts of China that are nationalist friendly. This is the entire country. And so what you have is, this is not just nationalists that are saving them, this is communists, this is collaborators, folks that are supposedly working with the Japanese. One case, a guy was shot down over occupied Hong Kong. He was picked up by collaborationist troops that had been working for the Japanese administration there for years by this point. They sneak him out of town and hand him over to nationalist troops at the border. So it's really interesting because it tells you all this interesting stuff about the nature of wartime China, the nature of collaboration, the avenues of communication that are operating between collaborationists, nationalists, and communists. There was one case where, and it tells you something about the initial reaction of the Chinese people themselves. Almost always, the first encounter is not with a government representative or guerrilla. It's with a peasant, right? Somebody that's farming rice. And you land in their rice paddy, and a lot of the initial reaction is just how they deal with that person. And what's fascinating is that, like, there's one case where a guy got shot down on a mission to Shanghai, China, which has been occupied by Japan since like 1937. And he's on this strafing run, gets hit by ground fire. He bails out 1 mile away from the Japanese airfield. The guys that shot him down watch him bail out and float to the ground, and they get in their truck to go roll him up. And by the time they get there, a mile away, he's already gone. The peasants in the village have like exchanged clothing with him to put him in peasant clothes, and he's on the back of an ox cart, and he's on the back of that ox cart for the better part of 2 months to get back to friendly territory, but he was gone by the time the Japanese got there. The other thing that's striking is the reprisals that these Chinese, especially peasants, were subjected to. And we saw this initially with the reaction to the Doolittle raid, where over 200,000 Chinese men, women, and children from these villages that helped the Doolittle raiders were murdered by the Japanese for helping them. What's interesting is that the vast majority of these cases happened after the Doolittle raid, when those reprisals were well known throughout China. So people still helped when they knew what the consequences were. So these are the kind of things that became clear through that research. It's very interesting to sketch out like the true nature of this alliance relationship, and some of the true consequences for some of these personality battles that we hear about usually in the histories. So to talk a little bit about more on the application of this research and what's possible to do in the real world besides just read hopefully an entertaining book. This guy here is Henry Minko, and he was a fighter pilot in the 25th Fighter Squadron, flying out of Yunnan in southwest China. Flew P-40s, mostly close air support missions for the Chinese Army that was driving out the Japanese in that corner of the world. And they just got in their brand new P-51C Mustangs, I think like a week before the mission where he was reported missing. This mission was really unique because they're doing interdiction missions. They're flying along the railroads in northern Thailand, trying to cut off the Japanese supplies that are supplying the armies in Burma and southwest China. And actually ends up in a dogfight with the Royal Thai Air Force, which was allied with Japan at the time, and gets shot down by Thai fighters and is never heard from again. What was really interesting is that this really showed what was possible again by fusing the local knowledge with the American archival information. Because working with the Royal Thai Air Force Museum, and specifically Sakpane Promtep, who's here, he's now a retired Air Chief Marshal in the Royal Thai Air Force and is just a huge history geek, we were able to actually basically correlate the American reports with sheriff office reports from Thailand during the war that were sent to the Royal Thai Air Force, that Sakpane found after a flood made them relocate records from the basement of the museum. He's going through these records that they relocate and happens to find these sheriff's office reports. And that gave us enough information to find more specific location of where folks were. And there were 2 cases in northern Thailand. And we were able to actually go to those places and actually still find eyewitnesses to these events who were in their 90s that had seen these dogfights and crashes take place, and were actually able to take us to the crash sites. And this particular one for Minko, he crashed up in the mountains. It was very hard to get to. And the site had not been disturbed by the locals because his body had never been disposed of in accordance with Buddhist ritual, and so they thought it was haunted. They thought that Henry Minko's spirit haunts the site. So we went up there. On the far side here, you can see our guide, who's 75 years old. He had stumbled across the site originally while looking for one of his water buffalo that had wandered off in the mountains 20 years before, and was able to take us back to that general area. And then using a metal detector, we were actually able to find pieces that had been buried in mud through the successive monsoons. And this picture here is actually shows the data plate from the engine-driven oil pump specific to a P-51C Mustang, which helped us identify as specifically Henry Minko's crash site. And now DPAA is actually scheduled to go excavate that site in January of 2024 to hopefully find his remains and bring him home. So just a really cool example of what can be done with this kind of research. And Henry Minko still has a living family that would like closure on this case. So finally, what's next? So I've done all this stuff on World War II in China. The last time I visited mainland China was 2017 and was trying to do this kind of work that we did in Thailand with the Chinese, because there's still over 400 guys on my list that are missing in China. And a lot of them are probably findable because there's great local records there to find where these guys were. Usually, if they died in the crash, they were buried by locals. And so we could find a lot of them probably. Unfortunately, the trade war started about 2 weeks after I got home, and that door closed. The Thailand door opened, and we were able to do those cases there. So my research, because I only have 3 years to do this PhD, I'm like, nope, not going to deal with China. So I've migrated to Southeast Asia. That was my area of specialty in the 6 SOS as well. So now I'm looking at essentially the U.S. Allied Air Forces in Southeast Asia during the Cold War, and that partnership between the United States and them, and specifically the Philippines, Taiwan, and Thailand. That relationship through the Cold War, and then what the consequences were for that through the war and then afterwards. So, and after that, questions? Yeah.
Well, that's terrific stuff. Thank you very much. It strikes me that there are many uses for history. And the more we keep coming back to this technological thing, database management, and there's going to be a time where their AI is going to connect all this stuff together and tell you where these people are. Because all these things are going to get linked together. It's phenomenal. It's phenomenal stuff. The other thing that struck me too from both of the talks, but primarily Ted's, America hasn't fought a war by itself as America. The American Revolution was not by ourselves. The French helped us out in the end, and it was great. We never fight by ourselves. We're always in a coalition, and these are the kind of stories that we need to get out to today's warriors, so they understand that coalition warfare is American warfare, and it always has been, and it always will be. Questions? No.
Yeah, for David, or Daniel, I'm sorry. Did you ever encounter or look into reports of downed Japanese airmen and how they were treated by the Chinese? Was there, I mean, obviously they're the enemy, but were they just kind of shot on the spot, or did they take a POW, or what?
So especially initially, you got to realize the context of this, right, is before the Americans got there in 1941, the AVG, these guys have been mercilessly bombed, just, urban areas, bombed, people, refugees on the road, strafed. So there's an immense amount of anger towards the Japanese. So a lot of Japanese pilots that went down, first of all, did not even bother bailing out. And this is something that John Allison talks about. He talks about how they damage a Japanese plane, and the guy would just dive into the flight line to try and take some planes out with him. He wouldn't even try. Some of the guys that did bail out or survive the crash landing ended up captured by the locals, and a lot of them were kind of subjected to mob justice. The nationalist government really tried to change that because they wanted to take these guys captive. They wanted intelligence. They wanted a bargaining chip with the Japanese. So they made a big effort to try and change people's opinion. Mixed results. The best story that I heard was in Southwest China, a two-person bomber, a bomber with a crew of 3 crash landed right outside this guy's house. And he goes up, one of the guys survived, one of the pilots, and this farmer takes him captive personally and forces him to work on his rice farm for the next 2 weeks, as a personal Japanese slave, until the Chinese army comes along 2 weeks later, and they're like, "What are you doing? You can't, no, we're going to take this guy now." So, yeah. And that guy actually survived the war. He was repatriated to Japan eventually. So, yeah, it was a range of things, but definitely very different than the American experience.
And I think that also highlights one of the big difficulties in teaching cultural war is just the ethos of combat for Japanese pilots versus Western pilots. That mentality, East v. West, is a constant struggle, and it's one of the reasons America has so many difficulties fighting foreign wars. We don't get it. It's a different thing. Other questions?
Did any of the Chinese reaction to American and RAF pilots, Do you think any of that was based on the hope of some remuneration? Or was just the nature of Chinese?
So one of the things that I found, first of all, initially there was a lot of confusion because there had been no friendly Air Force over China for a while. Which is the reason that the bloodshed ended up coming about, because one of the AVG pilots, Eric Schilling, ended up crash landing, captured by a local tribe of the minority Yi people who did not know what a Japanese looked like, and so thought that this blonde-haired, blue-eyed American might be the enemy, and so they took him captive. And so following that, the Chinese government issued the bloodshed. What's really interesting about the original bloodshed, most of the bloodshed from 1944 on and still till today promise payback. The original one did not. And most of, especially those initial farmers that responded, never received any payback for any of the expenses. And actually what's really interesting is that you're reading a lot of the reports, folks are giving these Americans money to help them with their expenses on their way back. So they're very seldom getting anything in return. Later on, from about 1943 on, once they were in nationalist hands, those guys would keep a running log of expenses and present it to the nationalist government after the guy was repatriated, and usually they would get reimbursed for that. But by and large, the average Chinese, especially the average rice farmer that was helping, they were not getting anything in return. And nor were they expecting it, they were giving.
Don?
I was in China at the American Embassy in 2005, and Chinese invited a lot of flying tigers and pilots back. The group went around to different cities, and out of the streets, so to speak, came elderly people who had directly or indirectly supported the 14th Air Force or the 20th Air Force during the war. And although they didn't say so explicitly, I could sense that they were saying, our good turn for the Americans, we got payback from the communists when they took over. That they, that maybe they'd been a interpreter probably for the Americans, and that was it. They were a pilot for CNAC. They never touched aircraft controls again, and were, given, menial jobs as a result. So besides the bravery of the Chinese during the war and helping with rescues and sometimes direct service to the Army Air Forces, there was this Chapter 2, and when their good turns, led to sanctions against them and their families. I can just remember them coming up and saying to me, I did it all for my country. Now, my country at that time was the Republic of China, but they were distinguishing between, they'd been punished for helping the Yankees when they were actually patriotic Chinese, doing their part of the war. So this is a story, I think, still to be told about them.
I think that's an interesting point that you bring up, and it's very clear that folks that were directly employed by the Americans or worked for like the War Area Service Corps as a translator or a hostile staff who flew in any of those organizations, especially even if they made it through the initial communist period, especially when you get to the Cultural Revolution, a lot of those guys had a rough time. What's interesting is that the communists themselves, and actually in 2005 on the event that you're talking about, Glenn Bonita was actually on that trip, so I'm sure you met him. And he actually was reconnected with one of the general officers, like a captain, I think, in the 4th Root Army, a communist formation, who had helped rescue him. And so the communists had ended up organizing with the OSS and other American organizations to actually regularize their rescue of American airmen. So what's interesting is there is, for folks, most of the folks that rescued American airmen were not employed by the nationalists, were not employed by the Americans, and probably didn't mention that rescue effort to avoid that kind of stuff. But also there's not a lot of evidence that like just regular peasants who just helped an American for, you know, get away from the Japanese from their specific rice plot received any sort of special punishment later, especially if they were in a communist area working under that communist construct, which is obviously being politicized now for whatever propaganda effect the PRC has in mind. So yeah, it is definitely a very complicated issue now, and Rana Mitter recently wrote a book called China's Good War, which I highly recommend, that talks about how the PRC is now trying to reinvent the history of World War II in China to kind of take advantage of the good war myth that the PRC basically fully cooperated in the defeat of the Axis during World War II, and essentially to justify their seat at the table as a world power now.